Good morning, beautiful children. I am so excited to read the next chapter of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. Yesterday, we learned that there were 7 rats that were in town that were electrocuted in the hardware store. It attracted the attention of the scientists of NIMH and also of the government who were coming to investigate. Something was strange about those rats. We also know that poor Mrs. Frisby is locked in a cage by Billy Fitzgibbons. So let's find out what happens to her. Today's chapter, Escape. At 10, by the kitchen clock, the Fitzgibbons went to bed. Dragon was put out, the doors locked, the lights turned off. The first of these was done by Billy on instruction from his mother. Not without some difficulty, he opened the door. "Come on, Dragon, out!" "Ugh, he won't get up. I never saw such a lazy cat. He gets worse every day." Finally, Dragon, protesting with only the sleepiest of whines, was picked up and deposited on the back porch. He scarcely opened his eyes. By that time it was dark. Mrs. Frisby waited a few minutes until she was sure that they were really gone, until her eyes were adjusted so that she could see the bars of her cage. The bars were vertical, smooth, no thicker than matchsticks, which made them slippery to climb, but by turning more or less sideways, she was able to grip them fairly well. She inched her way up to the sliding door and tried to lift it. Ah, she could tell from the first pull that it was of no use. The door was stiff and it was heavy, and she could not get a good enough grip over either it or the cage wall to exert much pressure. Still she kept on trying, first lifting the middle of the door, then one of the corners, then another, straining every muscle she had. In half an hour she admitted defeat, at least for the moment. She climbed back down to the bottom of the cage. She sat there shaking from the effort, and she thought, somehow, just somehow, she had to get out. Her children, even now, would be alone in the dark house, alone at night for the very first time. Martin and Teresa would be trying to reassure the young ones, yet they themselves would be sadly frightened. What would they think? Since she had not told them about Dragon and the sleeping powder, she hoped that perhaps they would decide that she had, for some reason, stayed with the rats. But at 11, which could not be far off, she could not read the kitchen clock in the dark, the rats would arrive to move the house. Or would they? Knowing, since Justin must have told them, that she had not come out of the kitchen. She thought they would. She hoped they would. And that Justin would go with them and talk to the children and try to calm their fears. There was something about Justin, a kind of easy confidence that would help them. She no longer had any doubt, of course, that the rats could move her house. It was a generous thing to do, especially at a time when they were hurrying so on their plan. Their own move, and they had no idea yet of how little time they really had, of the new danger that crowded upon them. If she could only get out, she would run and warn them, and it might still not be too late. She thought, it's a good plan and a brave one. It would be the first time in all the world that an intelligent being besides man had ever tried to start a real civilization of their own. They ought to have a chance, she thought. It was not right that they should be killed at the last minute or captured. Could it be that the men who were coming, were somehow connected with NIMH? Or was it more likely, as Paul had guessed, that they were worried about rabies? She decided it didn't really matter. The result would be the same. The day after next, the truck would come with its poison gas, and that would be the end of all their plans. Unless they could be warned. Wearily, she got up, she climbed up the wall to try the door again. She heard a noise. It was the kitchen. It was in the kitchen near her cage, a small scuffling on the hard linoleum floor. Now, what kind of bird can that be, with no wings? And then it was Justin's voice, very soft, and he was laughing. "Justin, I thought you might like to come home. Your children are asking for you. Are they all right? Are they fine?" "They are fine. They were worried, but I told them I'd bring you right back. They seemed to believe me." "But, how did you—" "Oh, that you were here? You forget. I was waiting just under the cabinet. I heard what happened. I felt like biting Billy full of holes. But as soon as I heard that you were safely in the cage, I went and told the children that you were all right, but that you'd be a little late. I didn't tell them exactly why, though. Now, let's get out of here. I tried and I tried. I just couldn't open the door. Oh, I'll get it open. I brought along a few tools, some burglar tools, you might say, in my backpack. Should I climb up the stand? No, it looks pretty slippery. I think I'll try the curtain. And in a matter of seconds, Justin had swarmed up the window curtain a foot away, and she heard a thump as he leaped and landed on top of the cage, which swayed under the impact. The noise was slight, but they both listened intently for a moment to see if it produced another from upstairs. But all was quiet. Now, let me look at that door. Justin climbed easily down the side of the cage. Oh, I hope you can open it. I hope you can. I can, Justin said, exclaiming. Easily enough, but I don't think I will. Why not? Because you couldn't. Just because you couldn't, Justin said, and they'll know, so they won't be curious. Let's make it open itself. As I expect, it doesn't have any real hinges. He pulled a small metal bar out of his backpack and was working and talked. Just a little wire ring, dime store quality, cheap, flimsy things. They're always coming apart. As he said that, one of them came apart. The door sagged and hung crazily on one corner. There, you see? You couldn't help it if you couldn't help it if they put you in a defective cage. Come on out. Mrs. Frisby climbed through and stood stood with Justin on the top of the cage. Now, he said, we shinny down and stand like a fireman's pole. You go out the way you came in, under the cabinet and through the hole. I'll go out the way I came in, through the attic. I'll meet you on the outside. Justin, Mrs. Frisby said, there's something important that I have to tell you. Something that I learned. Wait till I'm out, said Justin. We've got to hurry. You see, we're having a little trouble moving that cinder block. He was off, running silently into the front of the house, from which the stairway led 2 flights to the attic. Mrs. Frisby crawled under the cabinet, searched in total darkness for the small hole, and finally felt one foot slip down. She dropped through. The square opening of the foundation was easier to find. It glowed palely ahead of her, lit with moonlight. Justin was waiting for her as she came out the corner of the screen. The night was warm, and the half moon shone on the farmyard. Now, he said, what was it that you wanted to tell me? He spoke seriously. He had heard the urgency in her voice. They hurried toward the garden, rounding the back porch. There, a dark heap of moonlight, lay Dragon, no threat to anyone at all. Some exterminators are coming to poison all of you, Mrs. Frisby told him as briefly as she could of the conversation that she'd heard at the Fitzgibbons' dinner table. 7 rats, Justin said. Rabies? It might be, but I'll bet it was Jenner. When are the men supposed to come? Well, the day after tomorrow. To her surprise, Justin stopped. He looked at her in admiration. You know, he said, I had a feeling the first time I clapped eyes on you that you'd bring us good luck. Good luck? She was amazed. Oh, it's bad news. It's serious. We'll have to change our plans, and quick. But think how much worse it would have been if you hadn't overheard it. Why, we wouldn't have had a chance. They came into the garden. Is Nicodemus here? Mrs. Frisby asked. No. In a few minutes I'm going to go and I'll tell him. But first we need you to help get rid. We need you to help and get started moving your house. My help? What can I do? You can talk to your neighbor. She seems to think we're stealing your cinder block. She bit Arthur in the leg. At one end of the big stone in the middle of the garden, 10 rats were digging briskly, using scoops that looked more like teaspoons than shovels, piling the earth neatly beside a hole already almost big enough to hold Mrs. Fitzgibbon's house. But on the other side of the stone there was an impasse, and there another 10 rats stood, baffled, in a semicircle, and behind them they were deposited, and beside them they had deposited a jumble of equipment, odd-shaped metal bars, pulleys, wooden structures that looked like ladders, other pieces of wood that resembled small logs. But between the rats and Mrs. Frisby's door stood a small, defiant figure. The rats, looking enormous by comparison, remained a respectful distance away from her. "Why," said Mrs. Frisby to Justin, "it's the shrew." "Yes," said Justin, "and acting very shrewish, I might add." One of the rats was speaking. Mrs. Frisby recognized Arthur. "But I told you, ma'am, we have to do we've got Mrs. Frisby's permission. She wants us to move her house. Ask the children. Call them out. Don't tell me." "Well, what have you done with Mrs. Frisby? It's a good thing the children haven't heard you. They'd be frightened half to death. Why, if Mrs. Frisby wanted you to move her house, why, she'd be here." "Oh, it's all right," called Mrs. Frisby, running toward them. I'm here, here I am." "Oh, Mrs. Frisby," said the shrew, "you're just in time. I heard a noise, and I came out and found these creatures trying to dig up your house." "Oh, my, I tried to explain it to her," said Arthur, "but she just won't believe me." "I certainly won't," said the shrew. "He said you asked him to dig up your house. Thieving rats!" Oh, no, my dear, it's true," said Mrs. Frisby. "I did ask them, and they said that they would. It's very kind of them, you see." "Kind?" said the shrew. "Great hulking beast, what do you mean?" It took several minutes of reassurance by Mrs. Frisby before the shrew grudgingly moved aside, still muttering warnings. "Well, I wouldn't trust them. How do you know that they'll do what they say?" That, of course, Mrs. Frisby could not explain to her. The rats now commenced to dig busily at the dirt on top of and around Mrs. Frisby's cinder block. Justin said, "I've got to go talk to Nicodemus. You'd better get the children out." Mrs. Frisby hurried into the house. She found them waiting in the living room, unaware of the small crisis that had been taking place outside. As Justin had said, they did not seem worried. "We were scared at first," Teresa said, "but then one of the rats came to see us. He couldn't come in, but he called to us. We came out, Martin and I. He said his name was Justin. Have you met him, Mother? He seems very nice." "Well, I had met him," said Mrs. Frisby. "Now we'd better go outside. They're getting ready to move the house." "I'm ready," said Timothy. "I'm all wrapped up like a scarecrow." Martin and Teresa had taken pieces of warm cloth from the bed and tied them around him. Mrs. Frisby could not see him in the dark, but when she touched him, she found that they had even tied a piece of fabric, just like a bonnet, around his head and his ears. "Good," she said. "And now we're lucky. It's a really warm, dry night." They went up the small tunnel to the garden and watched in the moonlight from a hillock not but a few feet away. The rats had finished digging the hole, and all 20 of them were working near the house. It was a sight to see. And as soon as the earth had been cleared from the top and the sides of the cinder block, so that it lay fully exposed in its hole, all of the rats turned to the pile of equipment. Under Arthur's direction, the ladder-like structures became scaffolding, 4 small towers, standing one near each corner of the cinder block. Now across the tops of these the rats fastened strong, light bars of metal, probably, Mrs. Frisby thought, from the toy tinkerer's truck. From these bars they now hung pulleys, wound them strong with thin cord at the ends, and cords that they fastened hooks to, which they then slipped into the oval-shaped holes in the block and pulled tight. 5 strong rats stood on each cord. One of them, Mrs. Frisby noticed, was bigger than the rest. His friend Brutus. "Heave!" called Arthur, and the 20 rats strained on the cords, and the block rose an inch. Each rat stepped back in place. "Heave!" Another inch. Slowly the heavy block rose from the hole until it hung 2 inches above the level ground. "Steady, steady," said Arthur. "Get the rollers." 8 rats, 2 from each group, ran to the round pieces of wood Mrs. Frisby had noticed earlier. These resembled sawed-off pieces of broom handle, each about a foot long. 2 rats to a roller, they slipped 4 of these under the cinder block, so that they lay against the hole, like bars across a window. Lower it," Arthur said, and the cinder blocks came down gently on the rollers. "Let's see how it rolls." They slipped the rollers free, and They slipped the ropes free of the pulleys and rehooked them to the front of the block. 9 rats now manned each rope. 2 stayed behind, watching the rollers. Heave! The rollers turned, and the heavy block slid forward easily, like a truck on wheels, in the direction of the new hole. And when it moved off the hindmost of the rollers, as it did every few inches, the 2 rats in the rear would quickly pick that one up and replace it under the front of the block. Almost like a game of leapfrog, Mrs. Frisby thought, but a well-rehearsed game. The rats had planned carefully. They knew exactly what they were doing. They moved with precision, and they never wasted a motion. And within a very few minutes, the first of the rollers lay across the new hole, then the second, and finally all 4. The block was poised and in position. The hole was exactly the right size and shape. The rats had even dug out a new pantry hole in one corner and carved out a small tunnel that would connect the 2 rooms to the house. The towers and the pulleys were put away again, and the whole process of lifting and lowering was done in reverse. The rollers were pulled away, and the block was eased slowly into its new home. "It's done!" cried Mrs. Frisby. She felt like applauding. "Not quite yet," said Arthur over his shoulder to the other rats. "Get the shovels and the backpacks." Pausing a moment to rest, he explained to Mrs. Frisby, "We're going to cover it with turf, and then we've got to fill up that old hole with the dirt and the new one, or Mr. Fitzgibbon will wonder who's been digging up his garden. Also, we've still to dig you an entrance hole." In her excitement, Mrs. Frisby had forgotten the small detail. She could not get into her house. Now she watched in awe as Arthur and Brutus, using 2 small, sharp, long-handled shovels, dug the narrow tunnel down to her living room. It took them somewhat less than 5 minutes. It had taken her all day to dig the other one. "Now," said Arthur, "you can put your children to bed. We'll take care of the rest." And that is the end of that. Wow, those rats are pretty spectacular creatures. That was quite a bit of action there, being able to move things with such precision and so quickly. And so now Mrs. Frisby and her children will be safe, but what of the rats? I wonder what will happen next. So now that we know that Mrs. Frisby is safe, what do you think the rats are going to do? And are they going to be able to get out in time? Tomorrow we will read chapter called At the Meeting. So today I would like you to write me 3 or 4 sentences. Tell me, what do you think the rats are going to do to get out quickly? Have a wonderful Friday and a great weekend. Remember that Monday is the day that you get to make up any work that you missed throughout the week. I love you all. Have a great day.